As language models keep improving, one question that a lot of researchers think about is where are we going to get more data? Once you've trained models on all the data in the internet, or at that scale, when you think about some of the more recent models, they are trained on internet scale data. So where do you get more data? And what kinds of models are going to be needed to use that to make language models better? This is a question in a field of research that is one quite fascinating, because it opens the door to a lot of other methods, as we'll see here. So one important guiding paper, to me at least, is this paper from 2020 called Experience Grounds Language, that showcases different places to get data to make better language models. And so in this video, we'll go over that paper, visualized some of the ideas that they mentioned. And I think it's a really good approach for you to think about these other spaces to get modeled, because it opens the door to talk about things like image generation and multimodality and other types of models. So let's get into the paper. This is Experience Grounds Language by Bisk, Holtzman, Thomason, Andreas, Bengio, Kai, Lapata, Lazaridou, Nisnevich, Pinto, and Turian. And the basic idea is the following. So at the time that this paper comes out, they look at it like this. So once you have massive GPT, BERT, Roberta kind of models, you can think of maybe two stages of how language models were trained. A world scope 1, that is the world scope of a single corpus, and maybe you can think of GloVe or Word2Vec, even though GloVe is a larger data set, but I don't know if it's specifically internet scale. But then world scope 2 is this, when you start to get models that are more internet scale, with maybe even larger and larger models that are able to do transfer learning. And so these are the first two scopes that a lot of NLP is still in. The paper outlines this. So this is, where NLP is going and where can we get more data, but it also has like a really good example, like you can't learn language from the radio. If you're a human being locked in a room and you only have access to a radio and you've never talked to anybody in the past, you're not going to be able to learn language just by listening to a radio. And so that's kind of a guiding example of this thought exercise that this paper goes through. And they define this idea of a world scope, which is a way in which NLP potentially will be developing. And so the 5 world scopes are corpus, internet, which is most of current NLP in 2020 still is sort of, but we're sort of knocking on world scope 3 and 4, as we'll see here, because I'll update you with a little bit of some of the things that came after this paper was published. So perception and multimodal, embodiment and social. So let's get into those. And so here are the models, some of the examples. So Lambda and Bloom are just, both super recent, super massive. Bloom is this open source GPT-3 kind of like model trained in the open. But these are all trained on language and language data. So when you talk about world scope 3, here you start to have these kind of like multimodal models. So you start to have Clip and DALL-E and Party. And so these are models that are trained on both language and text. But more relevant for us are things potentially like Flamingo and OVA that are generating text, that have at least the image captioning portion of that multimodal. So Clip and DALL-E and Party are these models that you give a piece of text to, and so at least DALL-E and Party are. Clip models things in a different way. It can be used as infrastructure for other types. But okay, DALL-E and Party specifically are like image generation models, along with Glide, that you give a piece of text to and they generate an image. So they're not necessarily generating language, but they do have that multimodal aspect to it. So that's why I identify a little bit of differentiation between Flamingo from DeepMind, which is does image captioning, but also question answering about images. So you can give it an image, it will give you a caption describing it, but you can also ask it questions about it. OFA is a one-for-all type model. It also does a lot of different modalities at the same time. So the idea here is that, okay, World Scope 3 is the world of sights and sounds. We have so much data that we can model in addition to language, and that will improve the quality of the language models that you end up needing. And that kind of makes sense. There's so much that the models can learn about the world just from the text, but it makes sense that it will learn more. I have an example, quick example here. This is a GPT, a large GPT or like a generative language model. Go here. So this is a model that was trained only on text. We can give it this prompt and to have it generate. So this is a model that was only trained on text. So if we give the prompt, the color red has many shades with different names, including, and give it the indication that, okay, generate a list now. You can have the model think about it a little bit and give us a list of these names of shades of the color red. And it's really interesting and surprising how much the model learns from language without seeing color in its life, without seeing one image in its life. And, you can see I've even Googled some of these colors because, frankly, I haven't come across a lot of these myself. So in some aspects, these models learn so much more than what an individual human is able to know. But what if this same model, like, it makes sense that if you have these other modalities of lots of images, that the model's perception of the color red and the things that the color red is usually ascribed to is used into how the model represents colors, I guess. And so that is World Scope 3. World Scope 4 is embodiment and actions. So this is when you have a model interacting with the world and seeing sort of some consequences from the model. And here the model can have this feedback loop of trial and error. The one model that I can think of that I've come across, I'm sure there are many. Please let me know in the comments if there are other models that you think about as World Scope 4. And here what I think of is Gato from DeepMind. To me, Gato and OFA are potentially two of the most interesting models coming out this year because, one, they model a lot of different tasks in one way, kind of like what T5 did with classification and text generation and regression even. Once you have a one mode of representing the inputs and output as a sequence of text for T5, but for Gato and OFA as a sequence of tokens, you have really interesting properties that come. And you can start to experiment with, okay, if I train a model on these 10 tasks, will it learn to do these other 5 tasks? Will that transfer? Will there be that transfer of knowing how to do tasks it wasn't trained on just by other tasks? And so Gato, DeepMind's Gato was trained on 600 different tasks. So it's a generalist agent. And some of them are close, if not really at embodiment level. So in addition to generating language, captioning images, having maybe visual question answering, it was also trained on Atari games. It was able to model Atari games. So it was trained on them in a different way than how you would train the reinforcement learning model. So it was not hooked into an Atari environment and has the inputs and outputs. It was trained on sequences of other models and humans playing Atari, and it was able to learn these games better than an average human. And it's a model that is small in size, but that was impressive that it was able to do all of these tasks in one model, in one GPT-type sequence modeling model. So in addition to these, and in addition to video games, which are a kind of embodiment, there's also a robotics angle to it. And you can sort of see how adding that gives the model access to different understanding or modeling of things like gravity and how things sort of fall apart. And so that's maybe just one example of how interaction with the world. And the paper is great in that it gives you a lot of examples for all of these world scopes. But we'll go through these slides quickly, and then we can dig into the paper. So what do you do after embodiment. So you have internet scale text data, you have the world of sights and sounds and multimodal models, and then you have embodiment with the world. World Scope 5 is the social world. So this is where the example goes out and interacts with the world, interacts with human beings. It does negotiations. It says the wrong thing sometimes and notices somebody's face being disapproving or approving, and sort of modulating its sense of language and how to use language by how people interact with it and what kind of feedback it gets from, what kind of successes and failures it gets into these interactions with humans. And so this is a quick scan of these world scopes, and then we're going to go into the paper and see a little bit in more detail how they talk about them. So the 5 world scopes, as they mentioned them, are here, and then the paper goes into talking about them. So you shall know a word. So world scope 1, and so this is, you shall know a word by the company it keeps. And so this is how word2vec sort of comes together, LDA, these kinds of models that they mention, and so some of the data sets. And then the written world. So here you get things like Elmo, the Transformer, BERT, GPT, and the GPT-3. So I think this is 2 and this is GPT-3. Okay, and then you have these other sort of massive GPT type models, Megatron, Turing NLG. And then in this list, models that came after this paper would include things like Lambda, Gopher from DeepMind. That's a little bit of the state of the art in some of these models. And then you have the world of sights and sounds. And the reasoning here is that language learning needs perception because perception forms the basis for many of our semantic axioms. Learned physical heuristics, such as the fact that a falling cat will land quietly, are generalized and abstracted into language metaphors as nimble as a cat. And so a massive GPT model trained only on text can see this phrase used a lot. But if it was also trained on gravity and seen videos of cats falling and gravity and how other things fall and are very loud, the model would have more of that, a better modeling of the effects and expectations of what falling things and how cats doing it is a little different. Perception is the foremost source of reporting bias. The assumptions that we all see and hear the same things informs not just what we name, but what we choose to assume and leave unwritten. And a few of the perceptions here are, so audio, tactile, so touch, and visual input. And, a lot of examples here, heavy, soft. Yeah, they mention a bunch of these examples on multimodality. ImageNet classification is kind of a limited way of doing this, and one of the stepping stones toward this multimodality. And then they mention a few of the developments in this field. So that's World Scope 3, and then you have World Scope 4, embodiment and action. In human development, interactive multimodal sensory experience forms the basis of action-oriented categories. As children learn how to manipulate their perception by manipulating their environment. Language grounding enables an agent to connect words to these action-oriented categories for communication, but requires action to fully discover such connections. Embodiment situated action taking is a natural next broader context. And one thing to notice here, I don't know if you picked up on that, but when you talk about world scopes 1, 2, and 3, there's no talk of agents. You're generally talking about models. And then once you have something that interacts and has this interaction with the world, it's certainly not a model, and it's now an agent. It's an interesting linguistic sort of jump of what the type of model sort of becomes once it crosses this threshold. I'll not go into all of what the I'll jump into World Scope 5 to get more into the social world. So reading from the paper, interpersonal communication is the foundational use case of natural language. Language coming from just people using it together. The physical world gives meaning to metaphors and instructions, but utterances come from a source with a purpose. And they give an example here of the word bull being written on the side of a fence in a large field. And the meaning of it, the social meaning of it, is really not bull, it's danger. And the danger is on the opposite side of the fence. It's not the fence itself. Interpersonal dialogue as a grand test of AI is older than the term artificial intelligence. And so this is a reference to the Turing test, right? So that is the test that we think of as AI. So if you have a machine that can talk with a human being under certain circumstances and fool them into thinking that the machine is a human, that is the Turing test. That is the test that for 70 years now we thought of as the test of AI. And it's really the test for AI with human-like capabilities of language, I guess. AI can and is smarter and more advanced in a lot of other ways, and worse in others as well. We instead focus on why the social world is vital to language learning. And there are a few paragraphs here that go into this. So language that does something. They address philosophy of language and how it suggests that function is the source of meaning. And yeah, there's a bit more detail here. There are interesting things on theory of mind, language as in a social context. I think we talked about quickly about an example there. And then they make these claims and that sort of ground this definition. So the way they think of it is that World Scope 2 is a subset of World Scope 3. So this is 2. It is a part of 3. So you can't learn language from the radio, which is only, let's say, language that you hear from the radio. Television is better. So television is multimodal. That's World Scope 3. But you still can't learn language only from the multimodal world. You need to be in a space with actions and consequences that can be enumerated. So that's World Scope 4, which 3 is a subset of, and then you have 5, again, drawing on the trackpad is not the best. Not that I would do any better with it. Pen and paper, I assure you. And so this is a little bit of how they think about it, though. And this is an important part of the definition, because if you look here, you have a lot of reinforcement learning models that interact with the world. This is research over the last years. There's a lot of research in interacting with the world, but how much of it is with language and how much of it encompasses these ones that come previous to it. I think we're just getting there. Also on the social world. So you can think about the Microsoft chatbot Tay as a model that does language, that has interacted and was corrupted by the social world. But it's not really a World Scope 5 model because it does not encompass these previous ones according to this sort of section of the paper. Yeah, these are some of the ideas and models that I think are super interesting to be discussing. Hopefully, I'll be able to do a few more videos on some of these as I investigate them. But I hope you can now see how this, when you want to talk about multimodality or when you want to talk about the new directions that language models are expected to go out and model more data and understand the world better and to be able to generate better text and understand text in a better way. This makes sense as a map of where to think about data and how to model it. And so this is a little bit of why I'm really excited coming across a paper like Gatto or OFA specifically, or maybe Flamingo as well. One interesting thought experiment I'd suggest to you is, what would you think would be World Scope 6? So if we're not to stop at the boundaries defined here in this wonderful paper, how would you think about, is there a World Scope 6, 7, 8 to improve language? And then another really interesting thought experiment, I think, is to think about perceptions beyond. So they're human perceptions, vision, audio, touch. But, a lot of animals have perceptions that we don't have. They see spectrums of light that we don't see. They use audio and maybe echolocation as this audio visual thing that whales and dolphins use. And don't birds have this sense of magnetism, so they understand, they know where north is. So if you're to extend and extrapolate this also further, I think that would be an interesting thing. But this also gives the caveat is that this model formalizes things about human language, and so just the human experience sort of puts a frame around this. But if you're not specifically interested in language, where else would you get it? I think that's an interesting thing. I hope you've enjoyed this. This is a look at how this paper, Experience Grounds Language, defines these world scopes of where to get more data to improve language models. And I think it's a really good frame to think about where are we going to get more and better data to ground and improve language models in the future. Hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you for watching.